dear viewers, and welcome to our special coverage for the latest developments taking place in the country. Today we'll be shedding light on the developments taking place in the country after the Thursday's attack that claimed the lives of more than 30 people in northern Sinai, in light also of the African summit which was held in Addis Ababa and was attended by President Abdel Fattah al-Sisi, who did cut short his visit in order to come to Egypt and follow up the repercussions after the terrorist attack that took place late on Thursday. And to shed more light on the issue, we are very delighted to have our dear guest, Ambassador Ahmed Hagag, the former Secretary General of the African Society. Hello, Mr. Ambassador, thank you for being with us.
Thank you.
And before we start, we will see this report. An African Union Summit was held on Friday and Saturday in the Ethiopian capital Addis Ababa. Attending the summit, UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon, who assured the African leaders gathered for the summit for the support of the United Nations in helping countries affected by Ebola build back stronger than ever before. The details.
The United Nations said it has now shifted its efforts in Guinea, Liberia and Sierra Leone, the countries worst hit by the virus of Ebola, from slowing the spread of the virus to ending the epidemic. UN Ebola Coordinator David Nabarro nevertheless cautioned that the epidemic was still not totally contained. He said the number of cases is decreasing week by week and getting to zero in many places, but still occasional flare-ups occur. According to the WHO figures released in Geneva, only 99 new cases were confirmed in the week up to January 25, the first time the figure has dropped below 100 since June 2014. The WHO said the response has now moved to a second phase as the focus shifts from slowing transmission to ending the epidemic. The worst outbreak of the virus in history, nearly 9,000 deaths in a year, almost all in Liberia, Guinea and Sierra Leone, and sparked a major health scare worldwide. The three nations have been devastated by the outbreak, which began in December 2013, but all have seen recent signs that the virus is on the wane, with the number of new cases dropping weekly. Liberia, once the country worst hit by the outbreak, hopes to have no new cases by the end of next month. The WHO also said that a proposal to set up an African equivalent to the United States Centers for Disease Control and Prevention (CDC) would be a step forward. The World Health Organization admitted earlier this month that the UN agency had been caught napping on Ebola and pledged reforms to avoid similar mistakes in future.
Welcome back. Mr. Ambassador, how do you read the outcome of the African Union Summit, which did take place last Friday and was attended by Egypt, represented by the President Abdel Fattah al-Sisi, who did cut short, as we know, his visit there in order to be here in Egypt after the terrorist attack that took place late on Thursday?
The subject of terrorism dominated the discussion of the African leaders in Addis Ababa during the summit. I think most African leaders who heard and met President Sisi during the conference were shocked by the recent terrorist attack in Sinai, and because this is a development which is catching up in Africa now. As we know, Africa has been void of a terrorist attack in the last 2 decades. Only terrorism started to be established in Africa in the last decade. We find Boko Haram in Nigeria, which have killed more than 10,000 people or more. We found that the terrorists in Mali, we found the terrorists in Somalia, which is
the Shabab
in Kenya and other places. So they decided to take some actions which are innovation from African country, African Union. They decided to establish a force of 7,000 soldiers in order to assist the Nigerian government to combat the incursion of Boko Haram, beside the African Union force in Somalia and in Mali itself.
So from your point of view, what did lead to the rise of violence and terrorism in Africa in particular? Was what you have just mentioned, of course, the militants and the terrorist groups in Egypt, the Brotherhood Group, and we have seen also the situation in Somalia, we have seen that in Nigeria, in Mali. So what led to that as an African expert? How we can contain the situation which is on the rise every single day?
This is due to interference from outside.
Indeed.
Some countries, unfortunately, they are bent to implement their political agenda through encouraging terrorist attacks by some militant religious groups. Also, they take advantage of certain poverty in sections or segments of the society in those countries in order to encourage them to join the terrorist groups for the sake of either religion, what they claim, or for the sake of some material benefits. So therefore, we find a rise in militancy in certain African countries, but the terrorist attacks before were sporadic, but now they are engineered by big groups, well equipped by arms and furnished by financial aid from outside, or some also local groups. And those terrorist groups in Africa have a good coordination with each other. They are assisting each other. That's why we find Boko Haram extending its operation to neighboring countries in Cameroon and Niger and other areas. Somalia, Shabab, they are extending to Kenya and Uganda, and the one which has been committed in Egypt are taking direct from the Muslim Brotherhood and some countries like Turkey.
So from your point of view, sir, and from what Foreign Minister Sameh Shoukry said in his speech before the summit, that we are all facing the same problem, and most of the African countries are facing terrorism. So how can we unite our efforts in order to combat this increasing terrorism?
This needs a united African effort, because now this terrorist attack are extending to more and more African countries. And if an African country thinks that it is immune from terrorism, they are mistaken, because sooner or later this will come to all Africa. That's why the African Union members have to unite their forces in order to combat this phenomena, exchanging information about the African terrorist groups which are crossing the borders, and also even cooperating military in putting an end to this phenomenon in Africa, and trying to deny financial and material assistance to those groups.
So to continue before continuing our interview here, we'll go towards this report about the African Union Summit, which took place in Addis Ababa last Friday and Saturday, and we'll be back to continue our interview with Ambassador Ahmed Hagag, the former Secretary General of the Africa Society.
The African Union's rotating post of chairman has gone to Robert Mugabe. Zimbabwe's veteran president faces travel bans from both the US and EU for harassing opponents. For many in Africa, however, he became an anti-colonial hero. Since independence in 1980, his ZANU-PF party has won every election. Upon assuming the post, Mugabe shrugged off concerns that his appointment would harm relations between the Pan-African bloc and the West. At the close of the two-day summit, he said, "What the West will say or do is not his business, but rather ensuring that decisions taken are implemented and that the lives of Africans are uplifted." Mugabe assumed the largely ceremonial role on Friday at an African Union summit in Addis Ababa as its leaders and UN Chief Ban Ki-moon called for global action against Boko Haram in Nigeria. AU leaders plan to deploy a 7,500-strong multinational force to fight the movement. AU Commission head Nkosazana Dlamini-Zuma told the summit that the AU is expected to ask for UN Security Council approval for the force plus a trust fund to pay for it. Ebola featured also high on the agenda of the summit. Ban Ki-moon, who had tasked UN Development Programme UNDP with leading the initiatives of the UN system on Ebola-related recovery, addressed a roundtable on the Ebola outbreak. He assured African leaders gathered for the summit of the support of the United Nations in helping the countries affected by Ebola build back stronger than ever. The summit also focused on more than a dozen elections which are due to take place this year across Africa. Addressing the conference, the UN's ban told African leaders that they cannot afford to ignore the wishes of their citizens.
Welcome back. We continue our interview with Ambassador Ahmed Hagag, the former Secretary General of the Africa Society, about the developments taking place in Egypt and the African Union Summit, which took place in Addis Ababa on Friday and Saturday. Mr. Ambassador, we have seen President Abdel Fattah al-Sisi participating in the summit, and he held talks with many African presidents there. How do you see these meetings and his participation, although he did cut short his visit due to the terrorist attack that took place late on Thursday, just a few hours before the start of the summit?
Many African leaders were looking forward to have a bilateral meeting with President Sisi, which he managed even in the short time he stayed in Addis Ababa to hold with as many African leaders. And because they have seen a comeback of Egypt in Africa, and also the personality of President Sisi in trying to put the house in Egypt in order, and also combating terrorism, because many African countries are suffering from terrorist attacks now. So they wanted to get some experience from Egypt about how to combat this, not only militarily but also through combating the ideas and the culture which the terrorist groups are trying to convince African youth and citizens to join them. So he did have a lot of meetings with them. Those meetings were continued by the foreign minister, and I think in the forthcoming period there will be some bilateral consultation between President Sisi and many African leaders, and I'm sure that many of them will attend the economic summit, which will be held in Sharm el-Sheikh in March after the elections, parliamentary elections in Egypt.
We have to mention here that before cutting short his visit to Egypt, President Abdel Fattah al-Sisi was invited to go to the Ethiopian parliament and attend a session there, although he did not go, of course, due to the unfortunate developments that took place in the country. So how do you see his meeting with the Prime Minister of Ethiopia, Hailemariam Desalegn, and his invitation for President Abdel Fattah al-Sisi to go to the Ethiopian parliament? Do you believe that we are having more warm relations with Ethiopia nowadays?
Sure, we have some more correct relations with Ethiopia. Some instances it's more than correct, it's becoming warm. And the negotiation between Egypt and Sudan and Ethiopia are going so far good. Ethiopia is assuring Egypt that it will not harm Egypt's share in the Nile waters. We wanted this assurance to be
more concrete,
to be in written agreement between the two countries.